So we're recording. All right, so thank you and welcome everyone to the Awesome Python Meetup, our fourth meetup for 2021. Again, thank you everyone for coming. And today we have two awesome presentations. The first one will talk about data science volunteering for criminal justice. And the second about declarative Python-based monitoring apps. So our first presenter is Hongsup Shin. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Hope I didn't butcher your name too much. Hongsup is a machine learning researcher and a data scientist at ARM, where he builds machine learning applications to increase the efficiency and computer hardware verification. He is also a volunteer data scientist at the Texas Justice Initiative, a nonprofit that collects data and provides oversight for criminal justice throughout Texas. Our second presenter is Jim Bednar. He's a director of technical consulting at Anaconda. Jim holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Texas, along with degrees in electrical engineering and philosophy. He has published more than 50 papers and books about the visual system and about software development. Jim manages the open source Python projects such as HoloViews, Panel, HVPlot, Data Shader, HoloViews, GeoViews, Param, Lumen, and ColorSet. Before Anaconda, Jim was a lecturer and a researcher in computational neuroscience at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and as well as a software and hardware engineer at the National Instruments. And we're going to start with Hongsup. So please tell us more about data science volunteering and for criminal justice.
All right, let me share my screen. Okay. First of all, thanks for having me. My name is Hongsup Shin. I'll be talking about data science volunteering for criminal justice. I'll have all the questions at the end of the presentation, so please do so. I'm a machine learning researcher and data scientist in ARM. I build hardware applications for verification problem there. But before joining industry, I studied computational neuroscience for my PhD and behavioral ecology for my master's. I've been volunteering for different organizations, but I've been volunteering at Texas Justice Initiative, a criminal justice nonprofit in Austin, Texas, more than a year. Today, I'll be talking about two things. First, I'd like to talk about the volunteer work that I did at TJI, which was about police shooting in Texas. We published a report about police shootings in Texas last year. This is a screenshot of the report, which you can read on the website of Texas Justice Initiative. And then for the second half of my talk, I'd like to talk about some tips that I can share with you in terms of using machine learning and data science skills if you want to volunteer for nonprofits. So Texas Justice Initiative is a nonprofit in Austin that collects criminal justice data and provides oversight. It is founded in 2016 by Eva Ruth Moravec and Amanda Wook. And the main goal is to create data portal for criminal justice. The organization relies on technology volunteers solely, and currently we have 10 active volunteers here in the pictures, including myself. But we also had previous, alumni tech volunteers before. So many of you are probably very familiar with, the police shooting in the U.S. But if I can give you more context, academic researchers now widely acknowledge that police contact is a key vector of health inequality, and it is an important cause of early mortality for people of color. And people in the U.S. police in the U.S. kill far more people than the police in other advanced industrial democracies. And it is also recognized by international organizations such as UN Committee Against Torture. And then according to their 2014 report, they say police brutality in the U.S. is usually against specific racial and ethnic groups, immigrants, LGBTI, and so on. But unfortunately, in the U.S., the federal government actually doesn't have a national database for police shooting incidents. So instead, journalists have been putting a lot of effort to collect this data nationally. Two famous data sets are fatal encounters and fatal force. It is true that some local police departments, such as City of Dallas, City of Austin, have public data portals for police shooting incidents, but at a state level, it's actually very rare for a state to actually have database that tracks police shooting. In Texas, we have this database called Officer-Involved Shooting Database. So first of all, officer-involved shooting actually means two things. It is a shooting of and by law enforcement officers. So if you look at this data set, the victims will be civilians and also officers. So it was actually a pretty recent development because two state legislators actually suggest this House bill, and then it was actually passed in the state legislative body. So it actually requires all officer-involved shootings to report it to the Office of Attorney General (OAG) of Texas, and so this data is actually publicly available on the OAG website, which you can easily Google. But every data is actually saved as a PDF format, so you can easily read, but to actually digest for the analysis, it's a little bit challenging. So for many machine learning practitioners here, I'm assuming that you actually don't really get to experience the data collection process because usually we actually get the data from somewhere else. But I want to emphasize that data collection actually takes a lot of effort from a lot of people. Like as you have seen in the previous slide, legislation should happen, and then also law enforcement agencies should be involved. So I want to kind of give you more context of how this data is actually collected. So whenever law enforcement agencies actually identify an officer-involved shooting incident that happened in their jurisdiction, then they basically file this one-page report where they basically check some boxes for categorical features or write down some details about the incident. And those information includes date of the incident, location, demographic information of the people who were shot by police, and also the officers, incident cause. And then there's a binary variable of whether the victim was injured or killed, or also whether the person who was shot by police possessed a deadly weapon, yes or no. There's information about how many officers were involved, or whether the officer who fired the gun was on duty or off duty. So for TJI to acquire this data, we actually make a monthly request to OAG, and then they actually kindly send us the CSV version of this data. So every month we update our online data with new cases, but before we do that, we actually manually inspect and fix errors by cross-referencing with different reports. And if we actually find any errors, we actually contact the law enforcement agencies and ask for clarification. So last year, our director, Eva, told me about this annual report published by Office of Attorney General in Texas, where they basically summarize all the incidents that happen in Texas in terms of officer-involved shooting every year. And this is pretty much all they show. So it is a 3-paragraph summary of all the incidents that happen in Texas in a year. And as you can see, you can glance through it, but basically what they show is the total number of incidents in certain categories. So everything is aggregate. There's some information about race or incident cause, but that's pretty much it. So if you just read this report, it's very difficult to understand what this actually means. So to improve this report, we decided to do more in-depth analysis. So instead of state-level summary, we wanted to provide county-level analysis. And then we also provide multi-year intersectional analysis by looking at different combinations of the data. And also, we noticed that OAG's annual report doesn't really have information of how they pre-process data. And we think that processing information is very important. So we also make sure that our data code or the notebook that we use to create our report is publicly available in our repository, and it is also reproducible. So I want to just spare a little bit of time to talk about the importance of data preprocessing, because I think it is often considered janitorial, is often devalued. But I think when it comes to public data, preprocessed information is really key to transparency and accountability, because when you preprocess data as a data scientist, data analyst, you actually have to make a lot of decisions on, for instance, how you treat outliers or how you want to impute missing values and so on. And these decisions, especially if your data is very sensitive, these decisions can be very political. So it is actually very important to make these decisions public and explain what sort of logic went behind. So we did our best to sort of like explain the process and the thought process that went into when we process data. So this is a screenshot of our pre-processing notebook. And for instance, we found some duplicates in our data, and then we decided to actually remove the formal reports, because sometimes law enforcement agencies make amendments. So they update the report with additional information. So we thought more recent reports would actually have up-to-date information compared to the older ones, and so on. So after we pre-process data, this is the data it looks like. I'm not showing the entire columns because there are dozens, but basically we have information about time and location, demographic information, severity, incident cause. And actually the location and also demographic information can be much more detailed, but I'm showing kind of a high-level overview. One thing that I want to note is that in the form that I showed you in previous slides, when law enforcement agencies describe the cause of incident, they basically have to choose one of these 5 boxes. So they can basically check the box. And these are sort of the incident options that OAG basically give to law enforcement agencies. So we basically one-hot encoded it after we process data. So there's never been an analysis on a multi-year span analysis of officer-involved shooting in Texas across all counties. When we published our report last year, we wanted to kind of like comb through different combinations of intersectional data. And we decided to focus on race, first of all, because racial disparity is a well-known issue in police brutality. But once we started doing a lot of intersectional analysis and visualization, we were able to actually find a lot of interesting things that were not shown in the OAG report. So for instance, here you're looking at the total number of civilians who were shot by police across all counties. And we have intersection between race and age. So first thing you can actually see here is that we actually have very young civilians, basically children who were shot by police, at least one almost every year, which is highly disturbing and problematic. And when we actually started looking at the data at county level, we first wanted to see whether there's any correlation between the population size from US Census data with the number of shootings that happen in each county. And as you can see, there's some positive correlation. But one thing to note is that Texas has more than 250 counties. So in most counties, actually, there are not that many police shootings. And most shooting, actually, more than 50% of the civilians who are shot by police are actually from these top 5 most populous metropolitan counties: Harris-Spear, Dallas, Tarrant, and Travis. So what is interesting is that if we look at the race composition of all the civilians who are shot by police across all counties, the race representation between white, Black, and Hispanic are more or less comparable, pretty much similar. But if we focus on these top 5 counties, which have the majority of the shooting incidents, then this actually changes. So you can now actually see that Black civilians actually represent 40% of all the civilians who were shot by police in these top 5 counties. So at this point, you would think this is simply because, in these top 5 counties, we just have more Black civilians living in these locations, which is a reasonable assumption. So we decide to actually see whether that is true. So one thing we can do is that we can actually use the US Census data and then basically compare the racial proportion in census against the police shooting race proportion. So the way you read this plot is, for instance, for this blue dot, which represents Black civilians in these top 5 counties, they basically represent about 20% of general population from census data. But in the police shooting data, they actually represent 40%, meaning they are more than twice overrepresented. We did similar thing for fatal shootings, and in that case, we can actually use mortality data from Texas DSHS. So on the x-axis, we have proportion of race groups from all the people who died in a certain year. And here you can see that in this case, actually, it's not just Black civilians, but Black and Hispanic civilians who are overrepresented, and then white civilians are actually way more underrepresented if we actually look at the fatal shootings. We found this pattern pretty consistent across all counties. So you can see that along all the blue dots, which represent Black civilians, are above the diagonal lines for all 5 counties. And if we look at the fatal shootings against mortality data, then it is often the Black civilians, but also sometimes Hispanic civilians who are represented, and then white civilians are usually always actually underrepresented. We did similar thing by looking at the mortality data, but divided by different age groups. So you're looking at the mortality data for 3 different race composition with different age groups. So in this age group, given between 15 and 24, among all the deaths happening in a year in Texas, 45% of all the death in this age group comes from white civilians and 16.4 from Black civilians. But if we compare that to all the fatal shootings, it's actually the Black civilians who represent 45% of all the fatal shootings. So that means that Black civilians are actually 3 times overrepresented compared to general population when we look at the people who were killed by police in the police shooting incidents. A final thing that we also noticed was that Black civilians are, in a weird way, overrepresented in one of the categories in incident cause. So, as I say, law enforcement agency have to check the box to describe what the incident cause was. So there's this incident cause called other, and other can be really anything. So it's a category that has really low accountability. But you can see that for this other category, Black civilians are way more overrepresented compared to white and Hispanic, and it's also very prominent compared to other causes, except for hostage and barricade situation. So we didn't delve into deeper to understand why this is the case, but we thought, given the fact that other has low accountability, it was worth noting and then shedding the light on this issue. So for the second half, I'd like to talk about some specific tips that I've learned, and also I can share with you in terms of volunteering if you're interested. So first, if you want to volunteer, you will have to choose one. And I would actually suggest go for local instead of national or international ones, because first of all, you'll be surprised that it's actually very difficult to volunteer at national or international ones because they're very competitive. So you'll actually get rejection letters from these organizations. And also, local organizations don't really have good access to high quality tech talent. So if you go there and help them, you'll be actually able to make bigger contributions. Austin actually has a lot of really good organizations where you can meet a lot of nonprofit folks. These are some examples, so please check them out. And also, if you find a place that you really enjoy working, then I would actually suggest to stay a while, because the longer you stay, you actually get to experience different aspects of the problems that the nonprofit is facing. And also, the project that you work on becomes more diverse. So for instance, if you stay longer, you might actually be more exposed to engineering aspect of the project instead of sort of like analysis type stuff. And of course, if you're a first timer and then if you're really intimidated by the fact that you might be the sole volunteer of a nonprofit, then you can always join a place where you have other tech volunteers already. And also make sure you check funding sources and board members to see what they represent is aligned with your values. And also, definitely, I would suggest you to have reasonable expectations, because some nonprofits might have more readiness in terms of their technology, backend, but some nonprofit might really not have much. So in that case, you'll have to do more groundwork. And we all have imposter syndrome, but really remember that you are more helpful than you think. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them. I've thought about some opportunities that tech workers, especially machine learning and data science folks, can work on. And here are some of the examples. So in terms of machine learning and statistical inference, I actually intentionally did not use any machine learning techniques when I was writing the Officer Troubleshooting report, because I am relatively well aware that there's a huge risk and ethical concern of publishing predictive models in public, regardless of your good intention. So for instance, it is possible that you can build a model that predicts civilian death from demographic socioeconomic data for some reason. I can see a case where this can be misused by health insurance companies, because they might actually want to identify people who are at higher risk, more likely to be killed by police officers, and then they might start charging higher health insurance premium. And in a similar note, I also see some folks really want to use the significant testing a lot, like getting p-values and something. If you don't really have domain experts, and if you don't really have good hypothesis, and also p-value itself has many problems, so it's really easy to propagate misinformation in that way. So I would suggest to be very cautious. But I don't mean that you cannot use statistical inference at all. There are actually many ways that you can use it. One actually really good way is to take a causal approach. But in that case, you definitely need domain knowledge. So you'll have to work with the domain experts. And also, like in this paper, Let's Stick on a Pig, you can actually find a very clever way to use machine learning models to expose bias in the data. So my general suggestion is be creative and be thoughtful. But actually, what you can do easily if you're just joining a nonprofit as a data person is actually working on their data governance. So data governance is essentially documenting what the data contains and how it should be used. And it's a really great opportunity to learn more about the data. So one of the examples that we followed is from this paper, Data Sheets for Data Sets, written by Timnit Gebru and others. And it's basically a guideline for how to document how and why a data set was created, what information it contains, how it should be used, how it should not be used, and so on. So we kind of like created this, went through this exercise and then published this markdown paper, a markdown report. And this is some examples of the questions that we had to think about as a group. And for instance, it was a really good opportunity for us to think about sampling bias that our data might have. And also we wrote a section about the missing data and where it comes from, if it has, what is the best way to deal with, and so on. Another way to do some assessment is data quality assessment. So a lot of nonprofits will probably want to utilize whatever data they have, but sometimes their quality can be a little bit questionable. So in that case, you can definitely help them evaluate how ready their data is for consumption, and then help them or suggest any strategies to increase that. And once you have all this data information, it's also important to share this with all the users, because users should also be aware of what the data has and what kind of risks comes with it. When it comes to data journalism, I think I would actually say going for investigative report rather than just having a dashboard because I think depending on your dashboard design, it is possible that you will actually not have complete control of what the user will be seeing. So in that case, it is possible that the user might be misinterpreting some of the data that you're sharing. So yeah, I would say if you really want to build dashboard, I would say include investigator reports so that you can provide some context. But in terms of context, yeah, you don't really have to do statistical testing. All you need to do is provide good intersectional analysis and also compare your data with a lot of different reference data sets so that you know what your data represents. And reference data sets can be US Census, public health data, anything. And also, journalism is all about credibility. So transparency and reproducibility also matters a lot. And we did the thing also, but before we published our report, we were lucky to be able to show our report to two academic researchers in criminal justice before we published. So if you are done with your work, please share that with your domain experts so that your work gets verified. And also, I know that it is possible that you might want to include everything in your report, but you have to make a judgment call, especially if you have data that has questionable quality. So we had this binary variable that showed whether a person possessed a deadly weapon or not. And this variable is very contentious because it is known that how a police officer perceives an object as deadly weapon can widely vary. So it can be a gun, it can be BB gun, candlestick, butter knife. So we didn't really want to use this, especially given the fact that this data comes from law enforcement agencies. So we wanted to revisit, and so we left it out. In terms of technical aspect, I would say settle on visualization style in the beginning so that you can create consistent visualizations. And we were really lucky to work with our volunteer, UX volunteer, Julia, who audited our visualization style and then helped us come up with consistent and more meaningful visualization. So if you have that sort of resource, please consult. And also, I learned this through the process, but often, depending on how your investigation goes, you really have to create similar types of plots with small changes all the time. So I would say invest some time to create some custom modules so that you can easily recreate your visualization and analytics report pretty quickly. In terms of sustainability, I would say this year I wanted to actually update all the reports that I created last year with new data. And then I found that Python package Peppermill was pretty useful because I can just simply parameterize my notebook and then pass new data path, and then it'll just recreate all the visualization and analytic results with new notebook. And also, I think in terms of data preprocessing, we can also use modules such as scikit-learn's quantum transformer to specifically designate how the certain types of data in the data set should be preprocessed. That way we can actually make this process more modular and more streamlined. And also in the future, for some reason we want to actually use machine learning with it, then this can be easily implemented with machine learning pipeline in scikit-learn. So we haven't used this package yet, but I'm aware of it. And we also want to implement, I guess, like monitoring and triggering for schema maintenance and data validation, because what happens is these forms change over time. And also sometimes we would have unexpected data points that we haven't really defined in our schema. So we can have some tools where we can actually flag those easily. And our other volunteer, Lucas, is currently working on improving and implementing CI/CD flow for data preprocessing, so we can kind of increase the level of automation in our pipeline. And also, this is actually something that I learned from SciPy conference. But we have been actually using Google Docs to sort of like write reports that don't have any like code or anything. But we realized that if there are many collaborators, it's very difficult to track all the changes in Google Docs. So I suggested maybe we can actually move everything to GitHub and then use sort of like code review process to actually streamline and formalize our review steps. And our software developer volunteer, Dick, actually made it pretty easy with Netlify CMS. So even the volunteer isn't really familiar with GitHub, pull request process. They can just go and create a blog post like in a WordPress website, and then when they submit it, then it'll automatically create pull request in our repository, and the people can review everything there. So that way we can keep everything in our GitHub. It is also possible that you can conduct your own research. So for instance, Margarita, Leah, Shasha, and Lucas, and myself, we've been working on analyzing demographic characteristics and circumstances in shooting incidents, focusing on who the shooter is and who the victim is. So in this case, for instance, what kind of weapon is used in this, incident is quite important. So we're actually in the process of actually reading all news articles related to this OIS incidents. And actually our social scientist volunteer, Margarita, helped us come up with sort of additional data that we can collect through news articles, such as whether the police had a body cam on or which body part was shot, whether the victim was experiencing homelessness, and so on. Obviously, we are also investigating impact of COVID in jails, and Gilletta and Kenny have been working on it. Kenny also created a dashboard that tracks COVID-related deaths in prison and jails in Texas. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of community building. So even though you might be a mere volunteer, in a nonprofit, I found that it's really important to have a sense of community, because I think it makes your work more enjoyable, and it also prevents fast volunteer turnover. And in fact, a volunteer-dependent workflow is actually very, very fragile, because volunteers don't have stronger commitments because we are not getting paid. So what happens is that volunteer leaves suddenly, and then the project that volunteer was working on dies. So I actually found that robustness, accountability, and transparency matter even more. So there are actually many things you can do. I think tech workflow has a lot of really good practices in terms of automation, review, software engineering. So you can definitely help them adopt these practices. And also, I have seen some cases where tech volunteers from corporate come in, and then they basically sell their product to nonprofit, and then have them use it really deep in their backend, and then they leave, and then the nonprofit is stuck with those products. Don't do that. So use open source products as much as possible, and help the nonprofit protect their asset. Also, recently I realized that a lot of volunteers have been doing great work, and I thought it might be nice to showcase their work in their own words. So we're in the process of creating a blog where we can share our results, and a lot of people are writing posts, and software engineers are working on putting them together. And also, if you can, have a lot of review and teaching sessions for knowledge transfer. I found it really useful that teaching session can be a great remedy for imposter syndrome. So yeah, definitely I would recommend it. But volunteer burnout is a real thing. I've experienced it a couple of times. I think what might happen was I got passionate about something, and then I just, consumed myself working on it, and then I got exhausted. So pace yourself, take breaks if needed, but do not ghost, because if you just disappear, then nobody will know how the project goes. So don't do that. So in summary, I think, obviously it's a volunteer, so volunteering, so definitely there are some ups and downs, but overall, I really enjoyed my experience, because I think, first of all, like at work, the data that I work with is hardware data, so it's not really sensitive. And I think working with sensitive data, demographic data, really opened my eye to think about a lot of different issues. So I have learned a lot of different aspects of analyzing data and building infrastructure around it. And also, I think it really gives really interesting research opportunities in terms of causal modeling and explainable AI. But I think more importantly, it's been really rewarding because I was just able to work with a lot of people from different backgrounds, engineers, designers, journalists, social scientists, and also sometimes I talk to domain experts and work with students. And more importantly, I think the data that we look at and the issues surrounding it, it is all local. Like sometimes we have data from people who were killed by police in Austin and Texas. So it was really a valuable experience for me to learn more about socio-political issues in a local level. So final slide, call for volunteers. We have a lot of different skills that we need. We definitely need some work on our backend. So data engineers, and we have a lot of interesting research projects that you can work on. So yeah, if you are interested in, please check out our website. And yeah, if you have questions about volunteering or anything, you can reach me out at Twitter or email. And I just want to say that I have really enjoyed working with these spectacular volunteers. So I want to say thank you to them. And also I really appreciate you having me, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was really
Yeah,
solid.
thanks so much for the talk.
Well done and well researched and very clear. I loved it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question. So who is like you're doing all this research, so like what kind of impact, like how are you going to make your impact? Like if you find things, like who's going to be able to really use this data and make decisions, or like understand the part where you generate the data and hopefully is accurate and all that, but who's going to benefit from this and how is it going to make an impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. So after we published the data, we got interviewed by a few youth organizations in Austin and San Antonio. So I think just raising awareness through journalistic organizations was one thing, but I think also in certain cases, not particularly on police shooting, but our director is well connected with local politicians. So I think it can also be used as an evidence to make some arguments for legislation. So that's one way. That's another way. Yeah. So I would say those two things are main sources. Yeah.
All right. So journalism and some connections with the lawmakers.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Cool.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, actually, a few questions.
Yeah.
I recently had to call the police to report something.
Yeah.
Something that happens.
Yeah.
It's like, do you do anything in the direction of actually helping the police find criminals?
Not at the moment.
Are you planning to?
Well, so I think the two main data sets that we have is mostly, I guess, sort of like post-incident type of thing. So one data that we have is police shooting, and the other one is custodial death. So whoever who died in police custody or in jail or prison, we have been collecting that data. Actually, that data goes all the way back to 2005. So we are kind of providing oversight in that way, but not particularly, I guess, like actively getting involved in police activity, I would say. Yeah.
So you're not planning to actually help the police in that direction. You're mostly monitoring them, which is okay. By the way, if you're also monitoring them, do you have people that actually go and switch to the other side? For example, work for the police department, because I know that the police department actually has elements that monitor itself, or even legislation. So now, would any of you stop being volunteer for that and actually go and volunteer to actually do some policing and use the same data powers to do the policing? Is it something that you'll be open to, you personally, or anyone else in your group?
I think we don't have that's sort of like direct engagement, I would say. But I think, I think that's a really good point, because Florence question, we really want this work to make an impact. So I think a lot of the work that we do is just really, trying to kind of like raise awareness. And also I think we're considering working with other journalistic organizations to actually showcase this in a larger scale. So that's probably the path that we are exploring. I don't know what previous volunteers end up doing, but yeah, I don't think we have anyone who went into law enforcement. Yeah.
So you're telling me the next time I'm going to call because something is wrong, I'm not going to call you, I'm going to call the police.
Probably. But actually,
okay.
one thing...
No, you're not making a change in that direction that will have data science actually catch criminals, which is actually important, because the police officers will need technology like this, and they do need technology to find the bad guys. And I encourage you to explore this path as well.
I'll tell my director. Yeah.
Yeah, the bad guys need to be caught as well, and wherever side they are.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned while working on law enforcement stuff was that apparently police issue is very local. So for instance, like at a city level or county level, we can definitely make changes. And it doesn't have to be a federal level. So that one was actually good to know, because that means we have more likelihood of making changes in terms of legislation. So yeah.
Yeah, it's good if you're involved in a local organization. It's bad if you're in a national organization, because you can't change anything nationally. You just can't budge because it's controlled so locally. But it's great if you follow your advice and you join a local organization. So good advice.
Yeah. And I also experienced that. I also applied all these famous kind of like international organizations for volunteering, and I got many rejection letters, and then it really was discouraging. And then I looked around, and actually there are many organizations that actually need this sort of resources. And so yeah, that was really good to know. Yeah.
I'd actually like to follow up with a question about that part in particular. So I was really excited to see you had the slide where you're recommending places people can look if they're interested in taking their technology skills and making a difference in their community. I was curious how you found those organizations. Is it as simple as you go to Google and you say volunteer work in Austin?
Yeah. So actually, it was Open Austin that I went first. I actually went there in 2016, and I guess I went there by myself, and then I realized that I guess at that point, I didn't really know that there are many different ways that I can volunteer. Like I always thought, well, maybe I can just build a model. But usually people really don't need that. People really need actually building data portals, database. So I didn't really know how I can contribute, but I still kind of was active in Open Austin, Slack channel and whatnot. And I actually found our director there, Open Austin Slack channel, because I was also helping other nonprofit to get a resource. So I made a call, and then our director asked me if I'm interested in coming to their meetings. So that's how I started. Yeah.
Awesome. So the answer there is to join Open Austin, and in particular the Slack channel, which has lots of cool people.
Yeah.
So we have some questions that have come up here in the chat. And if you'd like to, of course, you should feel welcome to unmute yourself and ask Hongsup yourself. I'll read the first one out loud. And this is from Tom. And he asks, were there any cases where predictive ML had an influence on the statistics? Is that positive or not? And then he goes on to clarify, I meant models for predictive policing. Did they influence shooting statistics in any way?
I think that's a really good point. I think maybe, Tom, you're talking about sort of the feedback loop that predictive policing might create. I personally haven't really seen an example of how predictive policing can influence shooting statistics, but I think it'll probably have to go through how police officers operate, if that information had to be fed into. I am aware that most of the police technology that has some ML flavor is probably through body cam, and how the police department sends out the patrol to different neighborhoods. But I'm not exactly aware of it. Yeah, but I think it's definitely possible because I do think. Usually, I think those companies that make tasers and body cams, they also want to provide software.
Awesome. Thank you for your answer for that. We have another question from Warren, who asks, do you keep serial changes to department-provided documents, or do you only preserve the latest ones?
Oh, I see. That's a really good question. So for now, we have one old version, so that's my bad. But I think that the idea will be the serial version. I think that'll be really great. So basically, we will have some sort of change log for our data set. We also sort of explore the idea of automatically generating markdown documents based on certain updates. So we keep most of it the same, but if we have certain new information, then we will only update those. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for your answer there. I think having the changes is really interesting to see. There's a question from Sherry who asks, can this technology help neighborhood watch groups or reporting?
I see. So actually, maybe some of you already know this, but neighborhood watch, well, I mean, I guess it can help policing, but I think it can really also hurt, people who are already disproportionately affected by policing. So for instance, Austin PD is actually one of the police departments where they started using Amazon Ring surveillance technology. So I'm pretty sure some of you have that in your home. So that basically means that whatever is recorded in your home can be used by police. So I think probably the other way around. So it might not really help per se, but more like it can also really harm people who are already affected by racial bias in policing.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer to that. Were there any more questions for Hongsup about his work with TGI or about doing volunteer work here in Austin more generally?
I just want to thank you for doing this work and for telling us about it. Both of those are good things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Looks like there are no more questions. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Hongsup. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Thank you.